So hello everyone and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Siobhan Osgood and my presentation today is called Building History, the Great Northern Railway of Ireland. And as the theme of this year's festival is the War of Independence, I'm going to talk briefly at the beginning about the importance of the railways during the War of Independence, and then I'm going to go into the history of the Great Northern Railway and its first chief engineer, and he was the engineer that was responsible for the architectural style of the Great Northern Railway. And then we're going to move on to looking at the architecture itself, and we'll start at Amiens Street Station, which is Connolly Station, because this was the main terminus for the Great Northern Railway, and then we'll move up through the railway stations of Fingal. And the aim is that by the end of this presentation you'll have a really good understanding of the overview of the local architecture of the Great Northern Railway, and I'm going to intersperse it with some photographs of the station buildings themselves as well as some of the ancillary buildings, and then some of the original engineering drawings and some photographs from the War of Independence. So a brief introduction about me. I am researching the architecture of the Great Northern Railway across its entire network for my PhD at Trinity College in Dublin. I'm funded by the Irish Research Council, and I have a blog and a Twitter and an Instagram page as well. So if you'd like to follow me on there, correct me, ask any questions, please do get in touch. It's always good to speak to people and different stories and things like that that are attached to the railways. Okay, so we'll get started. So, railways in the War of Independence. It's important to remember the strategic nature of the locations, the connectivity, the importance of transport and communications, which made the railways a very valuable asset. During the Easter Rising and the Civil War, the railways really played and symbolised an important part of the countrywide military operations. Here on the left-hand side, we have the shelled-out building of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union headquarters, which was destroyed, and the view is taken from the Loop Line Bridge, which was constructed by the Great Northern Railway in 1891, and you can just about make out its lattice girder shadow on the lower right-hand corner. And when I come to the end of the presentation, there's a fantastic photograph of the Irish Republican Brotherhood all lined up in front of it, and the rebels are all lined up in front of it before it was shelled. So it's a lovely way to bookend the importance of transport architecture. On the right-hand side, we have a letter from the anti-treaty forces to the Irish Labour Party, and I'll quote directly from this letter. Owing to the use of the railways by the, quote, Free State headquarters for the conveyance of troops and war material and for the purposes of army communication, the destruction of railways under Free State control is an essential part of our military policy. The chief work of the railways is at present army work. So we officially notify members of your trade union that any of them who assist enemy forces in any such operations as repairing of railways, transportation or handling munitions and transportation of troops, repairing telephone and telegraph wires, or in any way obstructing our forces in the carrying out of their duties will be considered as combatants in the war and will take the same risks as the armed forces who are fighting against the Republic. So that's a fairly strongly worded letter which more or less says that if you work for the railway, you are fair game. One link is Sean Houston himself, which he was a railway employee and he worked for the Great Southern and Western Railway, and of course Houston Station is now named after him in his honour. And he actually wrote a final letter from Kilmainham Jail to the company manager of the Great Southern and Western Railway, and he gives his thanks to all of his former railway friends and asks them to forgive his offences. And he also asks that his mother receives his salary. Now, I don't know if that ever happened or not, or whether they forgave him. But it's a very fitting tribute to the importance of the railways during the War of Independence. So now I'm going to start and move on to the history of the Great Northern Railway, and we'll use its architecture as the central focus for this presentation, and like I said, we'll add some few bits in there where we've got the Easter Rising and the War of Independence as well. So here we have a map of the original Great Northern Railway network. As you can see, it starts in Dublin and stretches out all the way up towards Belfast and along to the west coast up towards Donegal. So the Great Northern Railway itself was formed in 1876, but it was an amalgamation of earlier railway companies. These companies were the Ulster Railway, the Dublin and Drogheda Railway, which is the most important line for today's presentation. We had the Dublin and Belfast Junction Railway, which itself became the Northern Railway of Ireland, and then the Irish North Western Railway. The company itself originally had over 600 miles of track and over 142 railway stations. So hopefully you can appreciate the expanse of my research, but also as well the expanse of the railway network and the level of connectivity and architectural impact, infrastructural impact on the country as well. So now we have the three main players, if you like, in our presentation today. The first is Sir John McNeill. He was the chief engineer for the Dublin and Drogheda Railway, which was founded in 1836, and he began work from 1838 onwards, from the Royal Canal up to Portmarnock, with over 400 men. So as you can appreciate, this is hard, heavy labour. The line had to stop because there was a dispute about whether the line should continue inland towards Navan or whether it should continue up the coast. In 1840, an Act of Parliament judged that it should continue to along its original intended route along the coast, and so that's why the train line exists as it does today, and that's where the Dart line follows. And now we have the man in the middle, which is William Dargan, and he was a railway magnate as well as an engineer, and he funded an awful lot of the early railway lines in Ireland, and he oversaw the completion of the Dublin and Drogheda Railway itself. And now we move on to William Hemingway Mills, who is not as well known as the first two. He was the first chief engineer of the Great Northern Railway, and he's my guy, he's my prime area of focus. So he started at the GNR in 1876, and he stayed with the GNR until he retired in 1911, and he lived in South Dublin. He is originally from Yorkshire, and he apprenticed at the Midland Railway under the guidance of William Barlow. William Barlow is the engineer that designed the train shed at St Pancras International Station, so I'm sure you can appreciate that he really did have a very high level of training. He then worked in Scotland, and then he became the engineer for the Andalusian Railway in Spain, and then from 1870 to 1874, before joining the GNR, he was the engineer and general manager for the Mexican Railway. So he really was a very well-accomplished international engineer. So for him to come to Ireland and to the Great Northern Railway was quite an honour. So the first station that we're going to look at is Amiens Street. And as we can appreciate, it's now called Connolly Station. I'm used to calling it Amiens Street, so I'll stick with that for this presentation. What's interesting is the Dublin and Drogheda line actually opened for passenger traffic in 1844, but it wasn't completed. The station at Amiens Street actually wasn't completed until 1846. It was designed by the architect William Dean Butler, and it was built of Wicklow granite, and it's here in this Italianate style, which you can appreciate with its large central campanile in the middle. And here we have one of his original architectural drawings. This is for the pedestrian entrance directly on Amiens Street, and hopefully you can make out that it originally had steps leading up to the concourse on the first floor. These obviously have now gone, and the changes were made in the 1990s. But what's interesting is that we have the introduction of neoclassicism, even though we have an Italianate building. And we can see that through the main arcade with its Corinthian columns and the central rounded arch entranceway. And this is a very faint engineering drawing, but it's signed in the bottom right-hand corner by John McNeill himself. So McNeill and his draftsmen would have created this drawing. And it's one of those things where it can look incredibly boring and incredibly plain, but to me it really is a thing of beauty and a work of art in itself. If you look towards the centre of the drawing, you can just about make out the tops of the iron supports, the columns which support the spandrels, and they actually have a Tuscan detailing to them. So neoclassicism wasn't even removed for the engineer either. He was still interested in decorative finishes. So a link with the War of Independence at Amiens Street Station. During the Easter Rising, Amiens Street was used as a base for the British Army for communication, such as the telegraph services, which of course all ran along railway lines, to keep in touch with London. The rebels cut telegraph lines and blew up railway tracks in order to prevent this system being used as communication. Such an example happened at Fairview, which is Clontarf railway station. The rebels actually then used railway bridges as well, coming up from Amiens Street as sniper lookouts. On the Tuesday of the Easter Rising week, the British Army left Amiens Street Station to repair the lines, but they were attacked at Annesley Bridge, crossing the River Tolka, and then they had to retreat. And there is a plaque on that bridge. I used to live around there. There's a plaque on the bridge that commemorates that. Another impact that, of course, this had is the travelling public. The passengers of the railways had to be put up with being treated very heavy-handedly by the British Army, being searched and sometimes even arrested, often just on the basis of being in the wrong place at the wrong time and maybe not looking, looking a little bit too suspicious. Another thing that happened is the railway employees, such as clerks, porters and telegraph operators, were also interrogated. Some of them were arrested and some of them were imprisoned. Sometimes they found as well that after they had been released, most of them were innocent obviously, the jobs had actually now been taken up by other people. Tough luck. So this photograph, like I said, is taken from 1921 and it's a photograph of the Black and Tans here. There's a handwritten note on the back of this photograph which says, prior to this photo being taken, an ambush had taken place. And you can see here they all look fairly pleased with themselves. Architecturally, for this presentation, if you look to the right-hand side of the photograph, you can just about make out the former ramp which used to exist, which is now where the Lewis line is. And this ramp was added to with a new entrance portico by William Hemingway Mills. And I do have the original drawing, but the quality of it is absolutely terrible and it really didn't reproduce very well, so I haven't included it in this presentation, but it does exist. So now we're going to start with the railway stations in Fingal. So we'll start with Clontarf railway station. Clontarf itself was originally a halting station which was opened on the Dublin and Drogheda Railway in 1844, but then it closed between 1850 and 1898. And of course the locals weren't very happy about this, so from 1891 a 7-year campaign started from the community to have a station installed at Clontarf again. And the Board of Directors minutes for the GNR really are quite dismissive of all these silly letters that they keep getting from these stupid little communities. The word is actually even used, which is quite offensive, actually, you can imagine at the time. It was finally looked at and appreciated in 1896, probably with an increase in passenger numbers, that actually Clontarf would probably be quite a viable venture. William Hemingway Mills designed this station and it finally opened on the 1st of April in 1898. It closed in 1956 And of course, the Dart line opened in the 1980s, but this station now exists further down the line. And the station and the Stationmasters House here at Clontarf became residential properties in the meantime. And this is the Stationmasters House. It has an additional entrance extension now which has been added. That's not the original design. We do have original Stationmasters houses at Malahide and at Hoth and Balbriggan, so we'll see the original design as it was intended to be seen. Really what's interesting is this is now the archetypal GNR style of architecture, which is using polychromatic red and yellow brickwork. And the red brick here is for the station and the Stationmasters House, used for the body of the main building, and the accents over the window and door heads and also the coins either side of the corners of the building are really used to great effect to tie the whole building together, as well as the yellow brick string coursing which runs around at the first floor. And this is a photograph of the RIC themselves at Clontarf Station. And obviously for military historians, this is a very interesting photograph. For me, as an architectural historian, I'm very interested in the wooden waiting shelter that they're actually all standing outside of. The reason being is because these are actually incredibly rare structures. We do have examples that still exist at Malahide and Gormanston, but they're actually in very, very poor states of repair and they're not looked after. And really this photograph shows that actually they used to be quite grand little structures. One thing you'll notice is the round-headed arches that are used for the window panes, and this was repeated at the front of Clontarf Station, and it's repeated all across the network for any kind of wooden glazing, for example at the wooden shelters themselves and also signal cabins. So this continuity of design really did start to stretch across every single GNR structure that was built. Unfortunately, this has now been lost. And here at Clontarf we have the Skewed Arch Bridge, which is a double arch bridge, which was designed by John McNeill for the Dublin and Drogheda Railway and again completed in 1844. Skewed arch bridges are actually incredibly complex as the bridge actually, if you imagine two sides and then you move, say, your right hand ever so slightly forward, the bridge has to actually morph and twist with that. So the arches have to be more or less mathematically designed, and of course these were all built by hand. So on site, the workmen and the stonemasons and the bricklayers would literally have had to hammer into place every single stone and every single brick as they were constructing it. So you can appreciate the enormous amount of engineering and effort and time that went into making this bridge. Thankfully it still stands. This is where the Dart station is now. And on the left-hand side used to be the canal, that is no more. That's now a road, and then on the right-hand side you can just about make out the former tram lines. The tram, actually the Dublin tram used to come through here as well. Obviously this photograph is taken during the Easter Rising. And it's quite a funny photograph because the British soldiers look a bit bored. They've clearly been told, you know, you're going to the front line and you need to bring all your sandbags and get ready and get armed and ready for a battle. And then over to the right hand side you can see a few pedestrians. There's a lady there asking one of the army officers, what's going on? Can I get through? Can I get past the bridge? And there's another man there who seems to be a bit fed up with it, and he's thinking, well, I'm going off to Fairview to do my shopping anyway, regardless of the soldiers are being there. But it's also a little bit misleading, because a day or two later there would be enormous casualties obviously caused during the Easter Rising. So this is a very interesting photograph. So now we move up to Killester. Now Killester doesn't have any station remains. I don't think it ever had a station. I think maybe it was a halting station and it had a wooden structure. But I haven't found any evidence of this, and nobody can give me a straight answer, so I'm kind of going on that basis. But these are the railway cottages which were constructed by the Great Northern Railway, and they're these bungalow residential styles of buildings. But I'll draw your attention now to the key architectural features that were used by the GNR, again, across all their buildings. Firstly, it's the segmental headed windows, and you have this projecting gable-fronted porch. And most importantly of all, and the main thing I look for anytime I'm trying to find a GNR building is the chimney stacks. They are of a very, very particular style of design, where up at the top you'll have a little bit of string coursing, just to add a little bit of interest to the chimney stack. And at some buildings, the string coursing at the top is picked out in yellow brick. Absolutely no need for it in terms of practical functionality of the chimney stack. It's just a bit of brick branding, and they like the look of it. And these are private residences, and I was given permission to take these photographs, but obviously I won't leave them on here for too long because they're actually kind of hidden away, so we'll get away from those. So the next stop is Raheny. This is quite residential in appearance, and would have been the original station designed for the DDR rather than the Great Northern Railway. But it's a fine residence and a fine station. The station master would have lived on the top floor. The passengers would have come down onto the platform. One of the rooms would have been the ticket office, and the other side would have been the waiting room. Unfortunately, it's been boarded up for years and not used, which is a shame because it's actually a beautiful building. One interesting story that comes with Raheny is that it was opened by the Lord Lieutenant Earl de Grey, and Daniel O'Connell visited the previous day before the railway station was open to the public and held a massive banquet for over 700 people at the nearby Edenmoor House, which is here on the right-hand side. This building, actually, this house still stands. It's now been subsumed by St Joseph's Hospital, and it was also known as Violet Hill, so sometimes the names of these houses can change. And one event that took place during the War of Independence was that the RIC barracks were burned down by the IRA around about mid-August in 1919. And the railway would have been used for transporting or for people to meet actually at Raheny in order to do that. So now this is Hoth Junction and Donabate Station. First of all, I have to say the present Hoth Junction station is a complete abomination. It's like being in an Escher painting where all the stairs go up and all the stairs go down and you never know how to get in or how to get out. Which is a shame, because here we can see on the left-hand side the original Hoth Junction station. Like Raheny, it's built in this almost Georgian front elevation style, but you have the coins picked out in the corners of the buildings, as well as the evenly spaced chimney stacks, which is something that the GNR would use later on. This station no longer stands, but it was opened in 1844. I have a suspicion that Raheny and Hoth Junction were designed by McNeill, mainly because they're actually very plain, functional railway stations, and they're free from any kind of ornament or fuss. On the right-hand side, we have the GNR's brick-built signal cabin. And it's incredibly rare because the GNR signal cabins usually had a brick base and a wooden slatted top. So this really deserves, again, a little bit more respect. At the moment, it's kind of been left. I appreciate it's in a difficult location to use, but it's not looking its best. But the brickwork that's used is very, very sophisticated. Again, we have the polychromatic brickwork, where the red main is used and the yellow bricks are used to accent the window heads, which are segmental window heads, like we saw at Colester cottages. And what's difficult to make out here, but if you visit the site you'll be able to see it for yourselves, is there's a black string coursing which is picked out in moulded bricks, which really kind of adds a three-dimensional moulding to the brickwork. Again, purely decorative, has absolutely no practical purposes whatsoever. One thing that's nice as well is the raised roof, which has its pointed finials. It had lovely wooden barge boards, which would have been carved from wood, and again, we'll see in the later railway stations, a lot of those signal cabins still stand. They were built to a standard. They were all designed by William Hemingway Mills, and he influenced the design of signal cabins in Britain and in Ireland as well. So really the signal cabins of the GNR are incredibly important structures in themselves. So standing just behind the signal cabin at Hoth Junction, this was the original Stationmasters House. And this wasn't built by the GNR. The reason we can tell this is because of the brickwork, which is almost patchwork in appearance. And the reason why the architect or the builder has decided to lay the bricks in that fashion is because in the early manufacturing processes for bricks, there was often heavy charring around the corners, the bricks that were being fired in the corners. So you ended up with a kind of kind of tidy use of colour. And it was used to great effect here to actually create a decorative finish. What's interesting about this building is we start to get a few different merges of styles. So if you look at the round-headed window on the first floor, you've got this labelling is what it's called, and it almost looks like a medieval monastery or a kind of Tudoresque mansion. Again, why on earth is it on a railway station building? Nobody has any idea. And then we have the nod to the neoclassical with the pointed pediment ending, and also then the columns either side with their Tuscan over-exaggerated capitals. And I'm sure you can appreciate, as we're looking at the colour of the brickwork, the more red, deep red brickwork are later additions, and chances are these were by the Great Northern Railway, adding a new chimney and an extension out to the side. Again, this doesn't stand in a very good state of repair, which is a bit of a shame. So now we move on to Saturn Station, which was built in 1847 and came out from Hoth Junction. And it's very similar in design to Raheny and Hoth Junction, again, probably designed by John McNeill. However, the canopy itself was added later by the Great Northern Railway. And we know this because the cast iron spandrels which support the platform roof have GNR emblazoned in them. And I think at this time, this is when the yellow brick chimneys were also added, because they kind of jar a little bit with the station design itself. And again, they have the string coursing up at the top. And over on the right-hand side, we have the standard class of signal cabin, which was designed by William Hemingway Mills. And we have the decorative barge boards at the gable ends. Unfortunately, one half is missing here. But the little rounded punch-out holes are the type of woodwork that we'll see used at all signal cabins, but also at Stationmasters houses as well. So the continuity even of the woodwork design is important. And they have these lovely wooden finishes of the pointed finials up on the roof, and also the pointed brackets underneath the roof eaves. It's a real kind of use of the cottage ornate style of architecture, and bringing in kind of a little bit of picturesque Englishness, if you like, into Irish railway architecture. And like I said before, it has the red brick base. It's unfortunately been painted. It actually would have had the yellow brick accents over the lower door and window heads, but the slatted wood is the original. Again, unfortunately, it stands unused and is in need of a little bit of TLC. I think it's recently been given a lick of paint, but it could be used so much better. And the reason that signal cabins became used all across the Great Northern Railway network and across all railway networks in Ireland and in Britain was following the Armagh train disaster in 1889. And this was an excursion train for school children, and it was coming up to an incline, and the locomotive couldn't bring it up the rest of the tracks. So it had this great idea that the train would split, and that the train itself would then be pushed up the hill, and that the heavy locomotive would be up at the top. Because there were no blocking systems, the locomotive lost traction at the top of the hill and it ran down the incline and smashed into the passenger carriages. Of course, the carriages were full of school children, so you can appreciate that this really was one of the worst railway disasters, right up actually until the middle of the 20th century. Sutton has one of the original GNR Stationmasters houses. So as you can appreciate, this is of a similar design as we saw at Clontarf, but it doesn't have the later extension added to it. And these really are beautiful, solid residential buildings provided for the station masters. It gives a real sense as well to the status that was afforded to this position within the railway company. The porters, clerks, things like that, they didn't get residential houses. And the key, again, architectural features that we have here are the polychromatic brickwork. We have the yellow bricks used as accent colours, and I really, really like how right in the centre you have the string coursing running around the first floor, almost like a belt tying the building together. The central projecting gable at the front as well, again echoes the entrance porches that we saw at Colester Cottages. And again, my favourite, the chimney stacks. If you look up at the top, you'll see the yellow brick string coursing running around the top. No detail was left to chance. One interesting feature that we have at Sutton as well is the beginning of the Sutton to Hoth tram. And you can see here the map of the original route of the tram line as it would have gone round Hoth Head. On the right-hand side was the electric power station, which was built by the Great Northern Railway in order to power the tram as well. And again, red, yellow brickwork. How did you know that the tram was run by the GNR? Because all of its architecture matched exactly into the railway network. Now, I'm not looking at the tram line today, obviously, but all around Hoth Head, the original tram stops themselves actually look like GNR railway stations, and they have the polychromatic brickwork. They're all private residences, and you kind of maybe have to sneak around a few hedges, but I wouldn't recommend that officially, obviously. You didn't hear it from me. So this used to be the boiler room, and it used to have 3 massive Lancashire boilers. Now, there are locomotive experts out there that will appreciate the sheer scale of those for providing electric power. These are now private residential properties, but this building actually lay derelict for years, and there was a massive fire, and thankfully it was saved and it was restored. So it's wonderful to see it in use. And one final note just to make about the architecture itself is on the side end of the gable end of the building, where you have again the neoclassical pediment coming out to the top, and the side corners of the building are these almost neoclassical columns, even though they're square. So they're taking little bits of inspiration from traditional forms of architecture, but they're mixing it and using it in an industrial way. So now we come to Hoth Station. Hoth was opened in 1847, again built by the Dublin and Drogheda Railway, and as you can appreciate, the front elevation is archetypal of the earlier stations that we saw at Hoth Junction and Sutton. But what's interesting at Hoth is that the platform side is an archetypal William Hemingway Mills yellow brick platform station building. This was altered in 1888, and that's also when chimneys, the yellow brick chimneys, were also added. And you can see here then on the right hand side another Stationmasters House. The gable barge boards are still in existence there, and you can just about make out they've got the rounded punch holes in them which ties them in to the signal cabins. And this is the drawing signed by Mills down in the right hand corner in 1888, showing the alterations to Hoth Station. And you can see how he has considered changing the platform side at the bottom, but leaving the front elevation of the station exactly the same. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It would cost an awful amount of money to have demolished Hoth Station and built a completely new one So they just updated the platform accommodation. And you can just about make out on the lower illustration, you have the original glazed entrance screen, which would have had sliding doors, which they're no longer in situ or in use at the moment. But you can see here that there was the addition, like we saw at Sutton, of the platform roof. This is the engineer's drawing for the roof. This was drawn by the draftsman Hugh Milling. He was an architectural draftsman, he comes from Belfast, and he worked alongside Mills for 10 years at the GNR. Up close, this is an absolutely beautiful drawing. You can't really get the real sense of it here, but the drawings are absolutely enormous. The use of shading, colour and light in order to communicate the design is something that I'm investigating as well, and it has its links back to the French military style of draftsmanship, which is known as descriptive geometry, which is all about creating depth perception on the page. So we think of engineers of maybe dealing with nuts and bolts, but actually engineering draftsmen were artists as well. And you can see here you've got the moulded cast iron columns supporting the roof. You have the dagger boards, the wooden dagger boards, which again are very decorative, but they serve the purpose of channeling rainwater down into drips onto the train tracks and away from the platform itself. We have the cast iron trefoil spandrels. And then over on the left-hand side is the close-up of the entrance screen that I was talking about. Again, beautifully designed, and the close-up details there show you the cross-section of the rollers that would have been used at the bottom in order to have the screen sliding back and forth. So next time you're at Hoth Station, have a good look out for the woodwork. So now we move on to Malahide. Like Clontarf and like the platform side at Hoth Station, Malahide really is a prime example of the polychromatic brickwork and its identity that it created for the Great Northern Railway, and also the quality of material and craftsmanship. The close-up on the right-hand side really shows all the different types of bricks, moulded bricks that were used. And every single one of these had to be considered at the drawing board. They had to know how many of them they needed to order, where they would source them, and also the uniformity of colour. Like I mentioned before at Hoth Junction, where the brick manufacturing resulted in charred brickwork, the later 19th century had the mechanisation and mass production of bricks. And of course, what did this mean? It meant a uniformity of colour and a wider availability of moulded brickwork. And you can just about see in the bottom left-hand corner, the top of one of the moulded window jambs, just to the side of one of the segmental headed windows. This is a nod, again, to a Tudoresque style of architecture. And again, so is the black string coursing, which traces all along the building and over the tops of the door and window heads. And of course, keeping in theme with Henry VIII is the central entrance portico, where we have this Tudoresque kind of entrance, which really doesn't sit very well, in my opinion, with the rest of the railway station. So I'm kind of a bit suspicious to think that actually this was a local, maybe the Lord de Talbot getting a little bit over-involved with the design of the railway station. Malahide also has, again, the archetypal GNR Stationmasters House and signal cabin, sorry. So we're used to these by now, but again, it's interesting to note that it's managed to keep the barge boards on both examples of architecture. And again, unfortunately, the signal cabin isn't in use anymore, but turn it into a coffee shop or something, I don't know. It would be very, very interesting. It would be lovely to see it back in use. More signal cabins. So here we are at Donabate Station. Again, Donabate is very interesting because it's an early railway station. It predates the GNR. We can appreciate that, again, you'll notice the charred brickwork and the way it's been used to a diamond effect, a checkerboard effect, sorry, for the station building. And again, it's like Raheny, where the top floor would have been for the station master's residence and the lower floor would have been where the ticket office and waiting room would have been. The GNR decided to keep this station. Again, it's a solid brick-built building. Why would you change it? But what they added on was the single-storey extension, as you see here on the left-hand side. And you can tell that it's a GNR addition because you can just about make out the yellow brick accents that are used for the string coursing. And here we have again, like we saw at Clontarf, the wooden waiting shelter. I should have mentioned as well, Malahide is a wooden waiting shelter as well. It's blocked over. The stuff that's in there meant I wouldn't actually want to go in there either. But it's got a beautiful capital running along the top, which, I mean, they used to be very, very nice shelters for passengers, and kind of a nod to neoclassicism as well, which kind of elevates it above being just a wooden shed. Another signal cabin. So here we are at RushLusk. RushLusk again is very similar to the earlier Dublin and Drogheda railway buildings, like I said, that were probably designed by John McNeill. But again, we can see that it has the yellow brick chimneys with the string coursing at the top. So the GNR obviously went around updating the railway stations. Again, the signal cabin is of the archetypal design, so hopefully you're really getting a sense now of the use of standardised materials, standardised designs and standardised construction methods in order to create an architectural and a visual identity for the company all across the railway network. And it's these little finishes that may potentially not seem very important taken individually, but when you apply it all across a railway network, you can really appreciate the sense of scale and the importance that was obviously applied to these kinds of finishes. And this is Skerries Station building here. Again, Skerries, for some reason, they've decided to board it up, which is a shame because it's actually a lovely little T-plan station. And it has this kind of rounded aspect to it, which I assume is maybe a toilet block, but I haven't been in and I don't particularly want to, so I'll leave that to the imagination. Again, you can tell that the platform roof was added at a later stage because in the centre here we have the cast iron spandrels and they have GNR stamped on them. Another interesting design feature again, which is completely frivolous, is the Corinthian column that is supporting the roof. Again, we have the signal cabin. What's interesting at Skerries is the Stationmasters House, which is down here on the left-hand side. It's a rendered example of a Stationmasters House. When I saw this first, I initially thought that what they must have done, the owners must have come along at a later date and actually rendered over the top of all that beautiful brickwork. However, when I went up into the Midlands and out to the northwest when I was doing my site visits, you actually have Ballyhae's signal Stationmasters House as well as one in Victoria Bridge, and they are rendered examples as well. So what this says to me is the GNR were capable of using different materials and different finishes, and it really highlights that the unifying factor, I'm very much interested in the brickwork, but actually it's the architectural shapes that are being used. Again, you have the gable over the front first floor window, and again it has an added porch which was added on later, but that would have again the round-headed entrance front door there. Although it does have nice brick chimneys, and I'm all about the chimneys. So, and this is one cartoon that I quite like about Skerries. Skerries waiting shelter doesn't exist anymore, but this cartoon gives us evidence that it did, and it was there originally. Now, the artist obviously has been focusing here on the raucous behaviour of people waiting at the train station after a day out on the seaside. And if I just quote here, "Cannot the railway company on such occasions have some officials or police to put a stop to the reeking blasphemy and obscene and filthy language that filled the summer air for over an hour, to which hundreds of respectable families were compelled to listen while waiting for the train. To be honest, not much has changed. I think we can appreciate travelling on the Dart. But architecturally for me, I obviously just quite like seeing that there used to be a GNR wooden waiting shelter. The artist hasn't made very good work of the lovely arched windows, but we'll forgive him that because at least he's providing evidence that the thing existed. So we move on to our final station in Fingal, and this is Balbriggan. Balbriggan is a very interesting finish to this presentation because it's designed by the architect George Papworth, who also designed Drogheda railway station, but here we have him designing one of the intermittent station stops on the Dublin and Drogheda railway. And the exact same station stands at Kells. Unfortunately, obviously, Kells isn't in use because that railway line is closed, but it's the exact same design. Now, it was completed in 1852, and it's this Romanesque little villa style of a station. It's very self-contained, it's very functional, and it's also very decorative in a plain kind of way. And I love the addition that he has here of the stone coins either side of the entrances. And it's been quite sympathetically upgraded, I think, with the addition of the glass screens as well, which proves when people put their mind to it, they can actually look after historical buildings if they really, really want to. So the GNR stamp at Balbriggan may not be at the railway station, but it certainly was at the signal cabin again, but also the Stationmasters House. Unfortunately, this now stands in a state of dereliction, but it used to be privately owned. And it was privately owned by the former station master, who was the last GNR station master, and he lived there up until, I think, the 1970s, 1980s. And unfortunately, since then, it hasn't been occupied. One thing I will say is that despite this, clearly the quality of construction and the quality of the finishes and materials has meant that it's actually been able to withstand being empty for 20 or 30 years. And you literally could move in tomorrow and really make a beautiful house of it. On the right-hand side, we have the Balbriggan Viaduct. This was designed by Sir John McNeill for the Dublin and Drogheda Railway, and it was completed in 1844. It's a large 11-arch viaduct, and it really is incredibly rare in Ireland to have such a long viaduct. There's some of them up towards into Northern Ireland, but specifically down towards Dublin, this is a unique example. Again, like Clontarf, you have the hammered stone external supports and piers and arches, but underneath the arches are all supported by gently curving bricks. And these bricks are, if you imagine the kind of average width of a brick, they're actually half of that. And the reason that they are is because it makes them easier to gradually curve round in an arch. And this bridge has remained largely unchanged, apart from the addition maybe of a few railings and maybe reinforcements here and there. But I mean, how on earth could you ever try and get rid of that bridge? Again, the quality of craftsmanship in its original construction. And in terms of the War of Independence, I realise I haven't spoken about it that much. I've been speaking about the architecture. But of course, you have the sacking of Balbriggan, which happened on the 20th of September in 1920. And I saw a wonderful video from the previous Fingal Festival of History by Jim Walsh, who gave a fascinating, in-depth recollection of the sacking. So I'm not going to do that, but I would recommend that people watch that video. Just to summarise here, there was an altercation in a bar which took place on the 19th of September, which resulted in 2 RIC men being shot. The Black and Tans, which were stationed at Gormanston RIC barracks, proceeded that evening to raid the town. They destroyed businesses, they burnt buildings, they shot indiscriminately at civilians and looted houses and murdered locals. Internationally, it really did bring the Troubles in Ireland to an international audience, and it was widely condemned in Britain as well. And here we have a photograph of the after effects of the sacking. So I'm going to bring the talk to a conclusion, and here is the photograph that I mentioned at the beginning in front of Liberty Hall. This photograph was taken in 1916, just before the Easter Rising. And again, we see here that it has, we serve neither king nor Kaiser, which of course is the famous catchphrase. And I really hope what this demonstrates is that railway architecture and industrial architecture, for example, this is a trade union building, was incredibly valuable in Irish architectural history. It's not just churches, it's not just castles, and it's not just manor houses that matter. Industrial architecture was used by the Great Northern Railway as well as other industries to create a solid identity of reliability, connectivity, and most importantly, status. They were incredibly valuable assets, especially during the War of Independence. They connected towns, cities, and countries with the transport of goods, people, communications, or ammunitions, or to be used to cut off all of those things. And I really like this photograph because it really demonstrates not only the continuity and the coming together of a nation and of workers, but also the hope that the Easter Rising gave to independence, which thankfully, despite the War of Independence and the Civil War which followed, did actually come to fruition. So I will leave it there. I will say thank you very much for listening. Again, my contact details are on there. And of course, thank you to Marguerite and to Karen for asking me to present today. And again, if you'd like to know more, please do get in touch. Thank you very much.